The title of this video is Unseen Beliefs Running Your Life. Most people believe they're living consciously, making free will choices, thinking for themselves, and yet beneath the surface, many, if not most, are unknowingly governed by powerful myths, deeply ingrained stories, beliefs, and assumptions, all working behind the scenes quietly shaping their decisions, their relationships, spirituality, and even their sense of identity. These myths feel true. They feel real. And because of this, they often control your life without your knowledge or your consent. Myths are something we all live with, and you really can't completely escape them. For the most part, they're really hidden. We don't usually have an awareness of them. And even though Joseph Campbell, who is the modern authority on myths, said there are no modern myths, what apparently he missed was the extended but yet very accurate definition of myths that I will give you shortly. In this video, you'll discover how modern mythologies operate in your everyday life. These are not the ancient gods carved in stone that the ancient cultures had. They're living belief systems, and they influence how you see yourself, your world, and even God. Some myths inspire growth. Others imprison your soul. And until they are seen clearly, they remain unquestioned, hidden, masters of your inner world, and they strongly influence the scope of your outer reality. You're going to begin recognizing how these unseen stories quietly regulate your choices, your fears, your desires, and your spiritual path. What are these myths that I'm talking about? Well, they are any story, idea, or concept without an absolutely provable basis of tangible, objective fact, yet which people adhere to as if they were all true and real. There are all kinds of stories and concepts that everyone believes and lives with as if they're true, but which often are not. For the most part, people create and live by myths to justify an action. In the realm of politics, we call it spin. In the realm of business, we call it being shrewd. In relationships, we might call them white lies. Our modern music and movies are all full of myths. In fact, nearly all the words are based on myths. And for the most part, that's all they're composed of. And these types of myths are just as powerful as the myths you're familiar with, which are usually associated with gods and goddesses from the ancient cultures. Those were the major myths of their day. And people based their lives on what the myths told them. In the spiritual realm, a myth is composed of spiritual insights told in story form. So all the spiritual books of the world are filled with them. Although some of them might be describing actual events, they're still myths because they're based on perceptions, interpretations, and ideas expressed as stories and metaphors. So a myth may be true or not, but they're filled with perceptions, interpretive commentaries, conclusions, and beliefs that affect your everyday life. And this is really why they're so important to understand. because they form the foundation of the actions that you take, the choices you make, even what you think in your own mind. It forms a backdrop for your life. It defines what everything you see is important. And they regulate all your decisions that you make every day. In the spiritual realm, most of the myths people attach their lives to came from people who had some sort of a revelation. They might describe it as an encounter with a legendary figure, maybe an angel, or an ascended master, or a god, or a goddess, or some religious figure, or some spiritual person from history. They may have been on a spiritual quest. Perhaps they were taking a psychedelic substance and it gave them a hallucination. Perhaps they were meditating. Maybe they were sitting in isolation. In some cases, these people may have been meditating for days or weeks, in some cases, even months at a time. Or maybe they were remote viewing or channeling. And out of all these experiences, they had some visions, they had voices, they had hallucinations, and they construct a story, which is a myth, that the vision or the voice was external and real. And because these things are so vivid, people are absolutely convinced that they are factual and true and real. And the information may have been presented to them dogmatically. And then they, in turn, relay that information dogmatically to other people. And before you know it, you have a movement or a cult or an organization or a following. And in some cases, entire religions have been created like this. The spiritual leaders or the teachers or the gurus or the politicians or the social media influencers and other public figures have amassed large followings of people looking for answers and who are drawn to those who speak of these events with absolute authority, convincing people that it's true. And then the amazing thing is that entire groups of people, and sometimes large groups of people, take these stories as absolute, irrefutable fact, and then they base their lives on them. In some cases, even giving up their lives. And this all attests to the incredible power of myth. So the person thinks they've experienced an absolute truth. They don't realize it's a perception masquerading as truth. The person may claim to be enlightened, or followers might make that claim for the person. So other people assume the person is enlightened, and therefore everything that person says must be true. And so this is conveyed and spread to others. It's imposed on the group. It becomes the official teaching of that group. And eventually, maybe it includes many of the people on the planet. The important point is to realize that the power, the control, the influence of myths is far-reaching on a personal level and on a global level. And basically, everybody is under the spell of myths. It's much like living in the Matrix, like in the movie with the same name. Very few living in the Matrix had any idea they were in a simulation. Of all the things you want to become clear on, such as self-defeating, damaging emotional reactions, or negative beliefs, or false beliefs, or rude behavior. Mythologies are the most difficult to clear. And the reason for this is quite simple. You are more unconscious of your myths than anything else you would want to clear because they operate in the subconscious areas and other places that you are not conscious of. So fear, anger, guilt, depression, emotional pain, health issues, physical pain, and all the like have their elements that are all in your conscious foreground. But the myths, they may be in your foreground, but most of them are in your background, and they're with you all the time, every day, every moment, every interaction. And yet you don't even realize you are operating your life based on beliefs that are myths. I've had people get mad at me for suggesting that they're running their lives on programs, much like a computer or like a robot. But this is really only further testimony to the power of myths. They convince you they are true, and you believe them. You defend them, and you base your life on them. If you are in a bad mood, you know that. It's not invisible. If you are angry, you know you are angry. But you don't usually recognize that myths underlying all of your choices, actions, and decisions and behaviors are real and believed. They're part of the way you interact and communicate with yourself and with other people. They're kind of like the wallpaper in the background, but rarely have you paid any attention to them or even noticed them or recognize them. And yet they're filtering the way that you believe and what you accept to be true. Humans are actually much more easily programmed than they're willing to admit, because what they believe feels absolutely true. In fact, I've even heard people tell me that. Well, I know it's true because I can feel it. And even when you factually present evidence, they still dismiss that evidence and they justify or they find a way to explain away why they believe what they believe. If you've never read the book, The True Believer by Eric Hofer, you'd find it eye-opening. And it reads like something you would think was written yesterday. And yet it was published way back in the early 1950s. I think it was written in the 1940s after World War II. And it lays out how people become convinced what they believe is true, even when contradicted with facts. This is what the power of myths is. So myths are part of all of the educational systems, part of all religions, all the political systems, all cultures. And they are present also in non-religious and non-spiritual contexts, just as much as they are in religious and spiritual contexts. So in other words, an atheist might say to you, I am free from myths because I reject the idea of any form of a deity. But they miss the fact that whatever their view of life is also constructed on myths. These are assumptions assumed to be true. All human interactions and communication between people are the processes of trying to impose one individual's myths on another person. One person's trying to convince another person their myth is actually the truth. Or one person is trying to confront another with a myth because they think the other person's myth is somehow wrong or defective or incomplete. People employ the effective method of imposing a myth on others by repeating it over and over. Repeating and stating their myth over and over, trying to make their myth clearer to the person that they're talking to in order to convince that person to accept their myth. One of Adolf Hitler's right-hand men, Joseph Goebbels, said that, and I quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." The lie can be maintained only for such a time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent of the truth. The truth is the mortal enemy of the lie. And Hitler himself said, make the lie big, make it simple, keep saying it, and eventually they will believe it. Now, what's amazing is even the person repeating the lie may come to believe it. Now, I've watched this happen with people that I've known. It's a type of brainwashing that works on the individual saying it as well as on those hearing it, because the mind cannot distinguish between reality from illusion, or you could say truth from error. So it functions in a similar way to repeating positive affirmations. Eventually, the subconscious and conscious minds accept the input. Those on a spiritual journey will often label those holding differing views as heretics. Sometimes they're even using stronger language, and they might claim you're a blasphemer. Metaphysically oriented seekers may say beliefs are distortions or illusions. So while you may be aware of this phenomenon, that doesn't mean that you've broken free from it. If you get the totality of the power of myths, it will affect every last aspect of your life, down to the emotional level, the belief level, the behavioral level, and maybe even the biological level and the cellular consciousness level. When you realize the depth of the power of myth, you begin to sense the impact of the phrase, the power of myth. With this deeper understanding and realization, you can perhaps begin to suspect that myths have us under their power. But armed with this being awake to this understanding, you can have the myth under your power. I'm talking about living consciously and deliberately, objectively, tangibly, provably, so you're not the victim of an unconscious myth. And once you get what I'm talking about, you begin seeing how virtually everyone has been caught in myths, including most of the so-called enlightened teachers and the religions. And I say so-called, not in a demeaning way, but if a person is living unconsciously, caught in mythologies, if it's something not objectively accurate or provable, can you really say they're enlightened, regardless of how spiritual they might appear on the outside? You can apply this to virtually every spiritual concept, doctrine, and tradition. And paradoxically, living with myths isn't wrong or bad. In fact, it would probably be almost impossible to live without them. But the key is being awake, recognizing them for what they are, and not being afraid to acknowledge it's a myth. You have to have beliefs to function. You can't function without beliefs. So where does this leave us? To truly live as an enlightened being, you have to be willing to look at and maybe throw out what you've heard, what you've thought, what you've believed, and everything you've heard about what came through someone, because those are all myths. Mythologies were created to cope with or cover up fears. You really can't know what another person's myth is unless you sit with them and explore it. So you can readily see the problem here of getting your philosophy out of life from a book, especially if it was a book written thousands of years ago. All you can do at best is speculate or surmise what you think the myth might be referring to. But what happens is you end up then projecting your myth on the ancient myth. So again, the operational definition of myth, that as I'm using the word, is any story, idea, or concept without an absolutely provable basis of tangible, objective fact, yet which people adhere to and are committed to as if they are absolutely true and real. So the myth is a belief taken to be fact. Now consider that the ego is basically built out of myths. All the ego knows is what it accumulates through the 5 major senses. So it is basically a collection of myths. Where have you been thinking your beliefs came from? You have an entire warehouse of myths built upon other myths, lifetime after lifetime. And this is where it gets tricky, because every word out of everyone's mouth is coming from their myths. That is, their stories, their ideas, their beliefs, maybe what they call their experiences. But these are all projections of perceptions and interpretations that they have been accumulating. The only exceptions are those who are fully enlightened, because when you are myth-free, you're also ego-free. And hence, by definition, you are enlightened. How many people on this planet are actually free of all of their ego personalities? Now, this can be tricky because many people want to believe they're enlightened. They base this on what they've experienced, what they have imagined, projected, seen, interpreted, speculated about. And I'm not here to tell you whether somebody's enlightened or not. Everybody has to figure this out for themselves. Everything people believe and base their life on are based on myths, which are assumptions of what they come to believe is true. So people's lives are actually a series of stories based on the needs and perceptions and interpretations and projections of the person telling you their story. What is commonly called truth is in most cases nothing more than a myth. I remember a book many years ago called The Amityville Horror. It said on the cover, "A true story," and it was later made into a movie. And a lot of people believed it was true. It was a story of a haunted house, and it was almost entirely fiction. But it said on the cover it was a true story. Freedom from Myth says it's okay to have and experience a myth, but you consciously recognize them for what they are. So this takes you on a path of self-discovery. This results from self-uncovery. Self-uncovery leads to self-discovery. In other words, when you uncover the myths, you find the reality that lives under them. One effective process for doing this is utilizing discrimination and inquiry. Asking questions is one of the most effective and powerful ways to lead you to the next step of your evolution. And this is what I mean by breaking free from a belief in and the control of your myths, your stories, your doctrines, your legends. Questions can help you see through the myths and the illusions. I remember one religious group that I was very familiar with that had a lot of unconventional beliefs, and it was led by a very dramatic, dynamic public figure. But behind his back, many referred to him as a legend in his own mind. And yet, because of his dogmatic convictions and his preaching delivery that was so affirmative, he had many thousands of people believing what he told them was the absolute truth. Well, after he died, for the most part, his organization splintered and fell apart because many of the mythologies began to crumble and fall apart in the face of objective research and facts. Discrimination means seeing what is real and what is illusion, that which is real and what is eternal, that which is less real and what is transitory. The way to this deep discovery is insistent self-examination through inquiry, monitoring your thoughts and actions through self-reflection, self-analysis, self-discovery, and asking yourself, what is the myth behind what I believe? What is the myth behind why I am making this choice? And you'll find after you practice this for a few weeks, and maybe a few months, that you will begin dissolving the mechanisms in your mind that are enslaved by the conclusions that it has come to from its observations and by listening to what others are saying. You become liberated, free. You become neutral, which means non-judgmental, peaceful, non-attached observer, and one who understands how illusions and myths are formed and spread. I recommend that you stop whatever you're doing at least 3 times a day, and even more so if you can, and take 1 or 2 minutes and ask yourself, what story or myth have I been operating under since I checked in the last time? You'll get better at it the more you do it. But finding the myths can be quite tricky. The myths you live by are mostly invisible. They operate in the background of your consciousness, what you call your subconscious or unconscious. And you assume and live as though they are true. So if you're really serious and committed to self-discovery through self-uncovery, you'll make this a priority. Sometimes what will help you discover them is to listen to the words to songs. Songs are 100% myths. Movies are 100% myths. And it's fairly easy to identify them there. And this is going to help you identify them when you find them in your life. If in a dream you are thirsty and you take a drink, the thirst is satisfied. But when you wake up, both the thirst and the satisfaction vanish because they were both dreams. Neither was real. You could say they were myths. Similarly, when you wake up from the illusions and the mythologies of life, you awaken to the liberating naked truth of what you are. So while you're living in a myth, they can be useful and meaningful, just as the water in the dream was used to quench a dream thirst. You only arrive at this point through constant inner reflection and discrimination. To transcend the myths, you must awaken from them by examining and inquiring about your perceptions and your interpretations. You must ask the questions over and over. What myth am I operating with this moment? And you will begin to uncover a simple purity that underlies all the stories. Chapter 32 of my Handbook for Enlightenment and Ascension is on self-inquiry. And it teaches you how to do it effectively, to break free from the distortions, the illusions, and the myths that have dominated all of history. And once you start doing it, you're going to find that it's fun. The discoveries are actually amazing. They're a lot of fun. And so I encourage you to do this and begin doing it today. And now until next time, I'm Jonathan Parker.